Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this exciting LinkedIn Live. First of all, I hope everyone's gearing up for the festive season and looks forward to happy holidays soon. But today I have an exciting panel joining us to discuss, just what happened at COP28 in the last few weeks, but also reflect on sustainability and the progress we have made through the year and what we think will happen in 2024 and beyond. I'm really excited, to see Babish and Rita join us today. So thank you both for taking time out. For people who've not seen me before, my name is Nitish. I'm a partner with Everest Group. I lead our focus on technology and technology services. And then within that, I have a specific charter looking at our work on sustainability. So I'm really excited for the conversation over the next hour. So without further ado, I'll get my co-panelists to introduce themselves. I don't think I can do justice to their profile. So, Babish, why don't we start with you and learn a little bit more about you?
Yeah, thank you, Nitish. It's good to see you again. Well, as introduction, we've worked a lot together, Everest and Accenture. I've been there for about 2 decades. My last role in Accenture was running the Sustainability Services Group. By now, I have more spread my wings in the climate change space as a professional and advisors to many startups, NGOs, and governments.
Perfect. Yep, I really value our collaboration and thanks for joining us today. And you were at COP, so we'll quickly dig into what you saw there and your observations around that. But before we do that, Rita, over to you.
Thanks, Nitish, and thank you so much, Babish, for being our eyes on the ground. My name is Rita Soni. I am Principal Analyst for Impact Sourcing and Sustainability Research at Everest Group, and it's been such a great pleasure to get sustainability embedded across our programs and across our work, working closely with partners like Nitish and others. And as I said, Babish, you were our eyes and ears on the ground. We were observing everything virtually, keeping our carbon footprint low. But really, love that you were there for us as well as your own work, and looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks.
Absolutely. And why one of the traditions we have at LinkedIn Live at Everest Group is try and understand where our audience is from. So please pop in the chat and tell us where you're joining from. And if you have specific questions for us through the conversation, please feel free to ping them in. Right. I think the beauty of this format is that we can be more interactive. So we will be picking up questions from time to time in from the chat and the comments window. So please feel free to do that. I'd love to see the kind of global audience we have today, Babish and Rita, just given how global this topic is, and it'll be a good time to reflect. So, while we do that, and I know, all the three of us are in different locations, right? So I'm based in London, Babish, you're in Amsterdam, and Rita, you're joining us from Brooklyn or New York. So, we are trying to straddle the world. So one of the reflections we've had as we look at the world of sustainability, the work Everest Group does, but also observes with clients and ecosystem partners, is that yes, there can be circumspection about different things, but people are getting serious about sustainability. Large organizations and governments are getting serious about specifically their net zero goals. And when we look at how we see the market, and we look at just not the signals people are putting forth, but the seriousness with which they're doing it, we do see a lot of that in sustainability. So we were looking at data, just reflecting on the kind of net zero commitments people have made. And we see whether it's nations or organizations that you see on the slide have made significant commitments. Is there more work to do? Absolutely. We do believe that there is a danger of greenwashing, and now with upcoming regulations, hopefully we can resolve that. And there's also a lot of consumer and investor pressure to do more. But what gives me heart being an optimist is that people are at least signaling investments and now are being measured on it. Now, with that backdrop, one of the things I wanted to start with is, Rita, you mentioned the fact that, we've been looking at COP28 and what's been happening, and Babish, you were there. As you reflect on the activities in the last few weeks, and I know it's been a hectic period, what were your top two or three reflections in terms of what you observed at COP28? Like and what gives you hope and what gives you despair within that? So, Babish, let's start with you.
Okay, yeah, sorry. No, I was trying to be polite to Rita. Yeah, I think the really key reflection is the level of consensus existing at the moment in the world about the direction and where we want to go to. So I think sort of yesterday was the victory moment in that at least the fossil fuels, whether it was phasing out, phasing down, or like we ended up with transitioning away from, um, in a way, it did not really matter anymore. The lobby, the fights against it, which were still happening last Friday with the OPEC letter, were sort of already changed on Monday night from my perspective. So when Al Jaber, the president of this COP, presented his text on Monday night, the whole world was disappointed. I've read 80 countries, I've read and seen 130 countries were against. So I think it was for me a real serious momentum that people are really wanting this, and whether it's governments, whether it's NGOs, or whether it's corporates. And I think in particular as well, the private sector, who of course heavily attended this time round, I think always people forget that COP stands for the Conference of the Parties. And that means the parties to the Paris Treaty. So in a way, it's a government circus, if you like, but I'm very pleased to have seen that it became a private sector circus. And of course, a lot of people see that as negative, but if you see the capital, the brain power that was brought in, which is of course needed with such a complex topic, is really all geared on now. And I think that was my first reflection. Coalitions everywhere, consensus everywhere, which means that, well, normally I've ended all of these kind of plenary sessions and dialogues and conversations also with Unities in the past with we have to act now. Well, I think that's sort of a no need message now, because the acting is really happening and I think people are on to execution. I was extremely pleased also to see China on stage all the time. And in many discussions I've been having over the last 3 to 4 years on what are we doing to get to a reduction of emissions if there are two huge emitters in the world, and that's China and the US. Well, I think everybody will be extremely pleased to know that China is really bringing down their emissions next year for the first time ever, and it will be structurally. So if you look at all of these data on China, it's enormous. For them, there is not a green energy transition, it's a true revolution. And as we know, with their different system, with communism, with planned economy, the goals of the companies in that country are the same targets and goals as their government. So they're leading on electric vehicles, they're leading on solar panels. And in a way, you can look at that as a very important center of power, but at the same time, we need all of the technology they are producing, and they're producing it, as we always know, at low cost. So it's extremely interesting what's happening with China. Last but not least, I think it is also important to say that one reflection is that science indeed did get ignored. So it was a comment from the lady who was negotiating for the 39 island state from Samoa. Her video is in the chat. I think it's coming up. And yeah, I think it's nice to see what a standing ovation she gets when she noticed those things. If people then ask, what do you mean science is being ignored? Well, there was a lot of the text which was supposed to be in the agreement. And I think phasing out fossil fuels is a very easy example. But also peaking in 2025 was a crucial one. So that is what the ICPP is in the end reporting on. And we had a global stocktake report. And that report just came up with 25 key findings. So it wasn't difficult either. It was sort of just copy paste from that global stocktake. What are the recommendations, what we should be doing? There were, of course, a lot of surprises, nuclear, carbon capture and storage, but we can maybe come back to that in a few seconds in the technology part, which we will get to.
I think that's really
Absolutely.
helpful. Sorry, Nitish. I wanted to jump in with maybe not three. I think Babish covered many of the aspects that were important. But I wanted to add one more. I think one of the objectives of this year's COP was that it was going to be the most inclusive. And I think the fact that they kicked off the event with pledges for the loss and damage fund, I think it's crossed 720 million at this point. Last year, what we saw in COP27 was actually a delayed COP27 because of this particular aspect, right? Wanting to create that loss and damage fund. So I think that's where the inclusion comes in. No, not to say that the comments on the island nations is not correct, because that absolutely the final language matters. But the fact that there's this fund that has gotten agreed to, and the pledges are very significant, I think that makes a big difference as well. And also, as part of inclusion, is that we saw conversations around health, around livelihood. So it was more inclusive and holistic COP as compared to the COPs that we've seen.
Yep. No, Rita, I think those are great points. And Babish, thanks for that opening dialogue on your reflections. And I agree. I think the fact that it took into account different stakeholders, and also what we've always said, that we need to follow, yes, the signals countries and organizations give, but we really need to follow what they do. And the fact that they put this commitment in needs to be followed by that execution. And, if you're just tuning in, I can see we have a global audience today, right from Sydney, which is very late. So I appreciate the fact that you're joining at this day at this hour in the day. And then we have people from New York, we have people from Portland, Bangalore. So we truly have a global audience. And I'm glad to see some of the comments around the fact that people are already on that journey. So I think there has been forward momentum. And if you're joining in, one of the things we saw at COP28, the deal, which is now being dubbed as the UAE consensus, is the fact that for the first time, there's going to be at least a deal around transition away from fossil fuels, and by countries in an attempt to cut these emissions by 2050. Now, fossil fuels has been at the center of a lot of the stuff at COP28, right? Just given where it was being held in a petrostate, and the some of the more unsavory news that came in when COP was kicking off. Now, you mentioned a very important thing, Babish, around science was not at the front and center as it should have been. And if people look at the video that the Samoan representative spoke about, there's a standing ovation at the end of this, and that shows that people want this to come in. What I also took heart from was, despite this, the fact that COP28 and the deal recognized that the targets need to be set in light of different national circumstances, and the fact that in different poorer nations may find it cutting emissions more difficult than, say, their wealthier counterparts. I think that's an important recognition that has historically held up progress. Now, if you really think about, yes, COP28 was a great, at least consensus that's developing around it, especially after last year's COP, which, I think people felt was a little bit of a washout. As you think about just the broader work on sustainability that you guys are doing in the space with clients, with organizations, with partners, if you really think about 2023, which has been volatile from an economic perspective. Secondly, there's a lot of geopolitical friction that we see globally, both here in Europe and now what's happening in the Middle East. What are your top reflections on sustainability and the progress you see organizations making, both from a seriousness and intent standpoint, but also the actions that they're taking? So, Rita, let me start with you first this time. So, as you reflect on that in 2023, what are the key things that you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think this builds on what Babish said about the role of the private sector. I think that idea that profit is a bad word, or hasn't. I think that idea is beginning to lose credibility. That we do need the private sector in order to scale these solutions and bring them to every corner of the planet. So I think first and foremost, we see that major industries are taking this very seriously and are putting their net zero targets out there, but also coming up with actionable plans. I think in our own work, when we look at the sectors that our clients are looking at very seriously. They're working with manufacturing, they're working with utilities, they're working with the public sector as well. So these public-private partnerships are also an important component of reaching these sustainability goals. So I think the good news is that organizations in the private sector are continuing to make net zero targets and continuing to make those plans and put them into fruition. And I think I've heard many say that we actually have nearly all the technology that's required to meet our sustainability goals. It's really about the execution and the will to execute against it. Certainly, to get over the actual heap, we need to continue to innovate. But maybe we're really talking about a lot more organizational innovation and maybe capitalism related innovation versus the new kind of technology that we need.
That's a great point, and I think the one of the things I'm taking away from that comment is there's a lot that exists out there, whether it's in terms of investments or the tech and the will behind it. How do we also utilize that versus just doing more, right? I think being more productive with it, I think that's absolutely key. Babish, what about you? What are you seeing as you think about the broader work in sustainability and in 2023, just given what's happening in the market?
Yeah, I think for me, the main takeaway of this year was that nothing was still optional. I think you and I have discussed that before. It was sort of a flavor of the month in earlier years, or optional whether you wanted to get on board of sustainability and this topic in your organization. I think that clearly ended this year. So it's a paradigm shift, if you like. And I think also there was a lot of education this year. So where some companies in earlier years only were aware of carbon footprints, everybody I think is now much more conscious about the use of resources, the use of water, the use of land. But I also feel that waste is becoming more and more relevant. So there's a level of consciousness which has changed from my perspective. And I think that's also sort of translates into what we've seen at COP28 now, is that there is a focus now on the heavy industry. And for some reasons, there had been a lot of focus on states, on countries, what are countries doing and what are governments doing. But I see the private sector and industries really being more and more aware of their role to play. And if you take, for example, an industry like shipping, and you would compare it to a state, in a ranking of largest emitters, shipping as an industry would be number 8 in largest emitters. So it's all relevant. And I think it also this year brings us much more, and also COP28 brings us much more to something I've learned in the Master of Science I did at the University of Sussex, and that's plural pathways. So in the Western world, we really like to think always about the solution as if there's only one. And I think for these complex topics, climate change, sustainability, what we need to overcome has such complexity that we need to fail fast and try a lot. And I think the plural pathways do it in all kinds of ways. And I think some people like it, others don't. Nuclear energy being mentioned for the first time in a COP agreement, I think it's very relevant. It's the reality. We might need it. And I think a lot of the tech investors are qualifying these type of technologies as the transition technologies. So it's not in the end game what we would want to continue to see. But when we're phasing out fossil fuels, we need to have the alternatives, and it's not all going to be straight on renewables. So nuclear is in the mix. And I think that is as evidence for me as that we're really on the path of understanding and recognizing that it's more than one solution. It's plural pathways which we need.
Yep, I love the term plural pathways, and I think the fact that there are more routes to get to that outcome, and we need to consider all of them. I see a very interesting question, Babish, which is slightly linked to your point around the fact that it's not optional anymore. So the question is really around the fact that the perception exists that in some ways sustainability was all the rage, let's say in 2022, this year everybody's become a Gen AI expert, and the current economic slowdown isn't helping. So the question is really around the fact that there's a sense of a perception that the current economic slowdown has slowed down the sustainable transition, and people can see this question up on the screens now. So do you see that, Babish, changing in 2024?
I see it as the opposite. So I don't see the economic slowdown at all as a reason anymore to slow down a sustainable transition. The only thing that seriously worries me is from a more geopolitical perspective, and that's the conflicts and the war we currently have in well, all over the place, and the key ones we all are aware of in the world still happening today. So I think that type of distraction and what is key for now to solve. It might be a strange side way to quite a few people, but if you look at the International Criminal Court, I have been in touch with them on a lot of the topics on climate change, because in the end, a lot of the climate change and also delaying actions are crimes against humanity. Some people think that in comparison to war, a bit harsh. But if you look at the people who will suffer from it, and I'm not talking only about now, but I'm talking in the next decades, we talk about knowing that this will happen, then you talk about crimes against humanity. But as we all know, there's a lot of conflict happening in the world, which is going to take priority to act upon today instead of a long-term topic. So that is my only concern. I think the economic slowdown, of course, always has an impact, but I think sustainability has really climbed in the ranking of top priorities very easily. And like I mentioned earlier, also with China being such an important force for change at the moment. And I think not a lot of people are aware well enough. Yeah, they see them as producer or selling solar panels, but it's really a revolution that is taking place in the country. And I think it's also a lot where we can learn from. So if you look at how they treat startups, companies that exist 8 months are getting billions to grow and expand very rapidly and get into production capacities, which for us would be normally a company that exists 10 years. So it's very funny to see a country with such a long-term planning speeding up so fast. And I think it's also an inspiring example. Yeah, maybe a strange, inspiring example. I would not have expected myself a year ago to say this, but it's to learn from that it's possible. So it's exactly what we need to be doing in Europe. What we need available in renewable energy, in electronic vehicles, everything we need, they are producing in a pace which is also needed. So I think that's going to be a very interesting country to watch in the coming year and years.
Yep. That's a great point, and I think the point on China. And if anybody has any doubts, you should just look at what's happening on the electric vehicle side in China. Just this week, they've announced, I think, the fact that they're going to extend some of the tax breaks they're going to get, but also the innovation that's helping mushrooms. It's really long-term thinking. But Rita, I know this is a topic where you have a very interesting perspective as well. So what are you seeing on sustainability, given what's happening in the economy and the geopolitical environment?
Sure. And I think Durgesh's point is absolutely valid. But I think one of the places that we saw the actual in 2023, the slowdown that he mentioned, was not in the E part of the ESG, but more on the S. So, I think in the previous years we saw sort of this balance. I hate using the balance because it seems like you need to trade off, but we did see a focus on sort of all the aspects under sustainability. And in 2024, because of the economic uncertainty, I think there was just a lot more focus on what are the immediate prioritizing and what are the immediate things that need to happen. A lot of commitments had already been made. So there was that transition plan that needed to get put in place. So I think what I'm hoping, and I think especially after hearing the Fed yesterday talk about interest rates, what I am hoping is that the 2024 is going to have a bounce back to a broader view of sustainability and looking at all of the aspects. But I think what's also happening is a lot more intersectionality and the view that these issues are so intersectional. This week we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the creation of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. And as part of that celebration and recognition, I was honored to attend a film screening. The film was called Hold the Line. And here, this was covering 3 environmental activists, or what they termed as human rights defenders, people that were based in communities that are, fence line communities. So where industry is based, and not necessarily taking care of communities where they're based. And what was most interesting was it wasn't just, a developing country, let's feel anxiety and sadness for all those poor people. It was across continents. So one of the stories came from Durban, South Africa. Another came from a small town in Louisiana that had been created by newly freed slaves. So you can imagine a minority community. And the third was in rural Colombia. And they were all talking about protecting the planet, but also the role of industry in the private sector. And interestingly, about how laws that are already in place are not really sufficient, which I think was also a lot of the conversation around 2023, the anticipation of regulation and what that's going to mean for businesses. So I think that 2024 is going to be a really interesting year from that perspective too. What are the regulations that are going to come, and how are we going to deal with all of these different intersectionalities?
Absolutely, and I couldn't agree more. And that's why I bring this slide up, just to show how we are seeing this. And echoing both what you and Babish said, I think we see that this is not an option anymore. Does adoption of sustainability enablement engagements, the way we characterize them, does it vary by region? It often does. If you look at, Europe has been at the front and center of this and is becoming more serious. North America has a little bit of a catch up going on now, since they've become more serious after the new dispensation, but also with the Inflation Reduction Act. And then we see specific pieces of adoption in APAC and the rest of the world. So it's definitely a priority, but some of the magnitude and adoption can vary. And then I think what's really interesting is when you look at the kind of commercial traction sustainability is seeing, which means not just about making money off it, but the real demand signals that large enterprises are putting forth. We look at, what are they signing this for? What are the kind of initiatives that they're undertaking? And what we see very interestingly is about 30% of them are around optimization, right? So sustainable IT, how do you reduce your footprint overall? But quickly followed by this big focus on decarbonization, which we spoke about a little bit earlier, and then measurement and reporting. We then have product and service innovation, biodiversity, and the circular economy as big initiatives. So, the summary in some ways is, yes, there are some challenges in terms of how do you prove the ROI and the impact of this, but it's not deterring how clients and organizations and large countries do it. It's just making them smarter and focus on what they can use that's existing, and how do they also become smarter in the next generation of some of these initiatives. So we definitely see a lot of that adoption and a lot of that giving us hope. Now, one of the things I wanted to pivot to, right, using this as a good segue, is we spoke about COP, we spoke about what we see in the market. One of the big things that Everest Group works on, and all of us have worked on in different aspects, is really around how tech and technology and data helps clients do this, and organizations do this more. Again, I'm also going to mention the G word, Gen AI. It's been one of the longest conversations I've had this year where we've not brought that up, almost the 30-minute mark. So that's great. But one of the things that people don't want to talk about Gen AI is really the kind of storage, the compute, the carbon intensity that some of its functions need. So if we focus on the role of technology and data more specifically in sustainability, how I wanted to ask you guys both on how do you see that evolving? And yes, we can reflect on Gen AI, but I think there are broader questions on whether you think of green GPT or climate GPT, whether it's sustainable IT. We see a lot of work, for instance, on using data for net zero advancement. So Babish, let me start with you. So, how do you think people can use technology and data smartly to achieve their sustainability goals?
I think one of the most interesting sessions I've been at was with McKinsey and Jim Coulter of TPG. And I think he sort of shared the notion, I think Rita was the one who just stated it earlier, that most of the technology is there. Of course, there are issues around scalability. There are other issues on AI about limits and regulation. So I think a lot of technology and a lot of innovation exists, but it's now a matter of trying to find also the right business models, even for electric vehicles. And I think what he described is we are still coming up with technology solutions which are building upon existing structures. Electric vehicles are building upon an infrastructure with roads. We have all kind of transition technologies. And I think it's much more about finding the right business models to make them scalable and make sure it does roll out and it rolls out quick enough. I think that's a big topic. Coming to waste, I still see what is going to be the best invention in relation to plastic. So plastics is not, I have not heard enough about plastics at COP28 this year. Of course, the most interesting topic about the fossil fuels discussion is that we talk about transitioning away from fossil fuels used for energy. That has nothing to do with the fossil fuels we're still using every day in our plastics. So that just remains. And I'm very pleased to say that there is still progress being made on the Global Plastic Treaty, and to potentially even put a ban on it, on the production of new plastic. But at the same time, I think, for technology, the focus will for me be on data, and in particular on policies which are going to make sure that there is an obligation to share data. If we are really going to look at the sustainable value chain, and if I see how much effort companies, there was a question, is it going to be impacted by the economic slowdown? Well, that not maybe, but the effort each company now needs to put into sustainability is too huge. It's just simply time consuming and a lot of money. So I think there we need to make sure that a lot of data is going to be shared and quickly shared. And I'm afraid that in some cases that needs to mean, or that means policy and regulatory changes, maybe also from a competition perspective, because I do believe that the next year and the next coming years, sustainability is going to be a competing factor even more than it was before.
Yep. No, I think those are incredibly important and pragmatic points. And one of the themes you keep coming back to in this conversation is around using what we have, reducing waste, but also becoming smarter around this, being more productive. Rita, we've done a lot of work at Everest Group, you and I and our teams, on how people are using tech and data to advance sustainability. We published a peak matrix assessment around net zero consulting services early this year. We've done a lot of work around the software side of sustainability and the systems of records that are now coming in. And then we have a whole body of work around Gen AI. But what are you seeing based on those conversations on how clients are using this, and anything that gives you hope for the future?
Yeah, and I'll add there's one more report around CCUs. We had an earlier question on carbon credit, and I think there is some disappointment out of COP28 when it comes to carbon credit. Thank you to who was it who asked that question? Oh my goodness, I can't even find it now. Mahesh, thank you for asking that question. I think we did see some disappointment around that. But what I will say that's optimistic is that as we started looking at the CCUS sector, so both utilization and storage, what we're seeing is just this blossoming of entrepreneurship. I like to refer to social entrepreneurship. But the number of players that are out there that are trying to be innovative with this space and Babish, when you mentioned plastics, I just had this image float across my head. You know, I'm not able to sleep at night with everything that's happening. I am definitely not able to sleep, and so there's a lot of scrolling that's happening. And there was an image that was shared by a photographer. It was a photography competition of I think it was a chimpanzee or an ape of some sort who was sitting on a pile of plastic, and he had a plastic bottle, and he was like drinking it the way we would drink it. And it is so disturbing to think about that. So, you know, and then I immediately also thought back to the story of stuff, which is, you know, now I think it's 25 years old, that amazing video that sort of created a lot of this momentum. Well, they also put out a video about the story of plastic and plastic bottles. And, you know, I think there's enough blame to go around. I think it's more about where do we find these solutions. And what I would say is what we're hearing in the market now, you know, as far as we start looking at 2024, is we are seeing businesses being cautious. There's a lot of focus on cost optimization, being more efficient. That is certainly there. And what we need to make sure is that we don't, you know, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater as we're doing that, you know, that this, that we sort of keep the focus on the end game of mitigating all of these challenges.
Yep, I think those are very interesting points, and you rightly said, you know, it reminded me of the recent research we published around carbon emission, right, where we looked at, if you look at mapping this whole entire carbon mitigation landscape, we looked at really truly what we call trailblazing companies. So these are startups, emerging, innovative companies who are doing really pioneering stuff, you know, in terms of how they help manage carbon emissions. So we'll pop that link into the chat shortly, and I think that'll be an interesting read for everyone involved. So let's hone in a little bit on Gen AI. I do want to get to the root of it, because I think now, you know, it's interesting we're talking right now. You know, a few weeks ago we celebrated or marked, you know, the first anniversary of ChatGPT. I remember a time before the 30th of November 2022 where I used to be a tech analyst. I've just been talking about Gen AI the last year, but what I see is clients have often, or, you know, organizations have gone through 2 or 3 phases of their Gen AI journey. The first 6 months was, is this real, or is this another metaverse moment? Do I need to care about this? Most people now realize that it's real. The last 6 months, you've seen lots of organizations doing lots of pilots in specific areas, you know, contact center data, content supply chain, IT help desk, you know, other different things. And now they're saying, you know, how do I scale Gen AI, and where do I scale Gen AI? And one of the biggest considerations we've seen in RFPs and questions from enterprise customers is, when I'm, you know, choosing a Gen AI solution, or whether I should do Gen AI for a certain function, what's the sustainability footprint of this? Because the storage, the compute requirements are really, really big, you know, both in terms of what's used to train the models, or the large language models, or LLMs. We're seeing a trend towards tinier or smaller LLMs. But then also, once it's live, you know, the energy that they consume, and whether that's giving us enough returns. So when we think of, you know, Gen AI and what it could do to increase exponentially these compute requirements, and therefore our electricity and other consumption, what do you feel is going to happen? And are you seeing some interesting approaches around that? I know, Babish, this is something that's close to your heart, given all the work you're doing in the ecosystem. So why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think my answer hasn't changed to that a lot. I mean, I think in the end, it does require also a lot of energy. So it's not the most sustainable solution. At the same time, this COP again proves that we're not making the progress we should be making. And with the complexity of the topic, I think I shared with you the climate GPT, and people can check this out and try it for themselves. It gives you very fast, in 30 seconds, answers to the most complex climate change questions. That is not possible today if you would Google it. You would get into very difficult scientific books and articles, but you would not get the answers to the topics, because the AI is capable of having, well, you could say literally having read those books. So before all the humans and the resources we need for this complex topics have read all that information and all that scientific data, it would cost us years. So I think still, because it saves us so much time and the intelligence is so much higher and it's not making the same mistakes which humans have as a clear feature to make the same mistakes twice or three times even. I think we can, for this, well, maybe again as a transition technology, we can really not do without it for the climate topics at hand at the moment and the problems we need to solve. I would say again, it is supposed to be a lot of open source and again a lot of sharing of data. Because if everybody is going to figure this out themselves, again, we don't have the time for it, we don't have the money. So I think it's here to stay. Of course, in Europe, we have our first, well, almost you could say pilot regulation. Regulation will continue to be needed. But I think this is a key element of all of the solutions we're looking for climate change. And it's here to stay for the next coming years, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, on this topic, there will be, in my opinion, mushrooming of innovation which helps solve for this, because I think the door has fundamentally been opened on using Gen AI, and I think we will scale that in due course once we figure out the safety, the sustainability, and the cost aspect of this. But we can't bolt the door now. I think the technology is out there. It's about how do we do it safely and sustainably. So
Yeah.
we will see a lot of that innovation around how do we develop this, how do we monitor these emissions, make it more productive. I love your point around climate GPT. I'm sure at some point we can pop in a link in the chat just so that people can experience it on their own. We are seeing conversations around greener LLMs and how that plays a role. So Rita, I wonder if you have any interesting points of views around that as we get to some of our final comments.
No, I love the concept of climate GPT. I think we just want to emphasize the adoption of that as more of an interesting point. I think in our Everest Group research, and particularly every year as the year is coming to a wrap, we start to put out a lot of research on what are the key issues for upcoming. And the one place that we did talk about sustainability and ESG is in relation to Gen AI. But if you look at where we're at technologically from a Gen AI application, many of the other solutions have progressed a lot more and are in production. Such as thinking about customer service apps and many things that we're actually already using, but when it comes to using this innovative technologies, this like very powerful technology for sustainability and ESG, we're still seeing things at the pilot stage. And I think that's where we're hoping to see progress in 2024, that's one of the movements that's going to happen.
Yep, I agree. I think that's a really interesting point. As we do this conversation, we also wanted to make sure that people who are dialing in, tuning in today, can also see some of our research around this. So I'm really happy that we are happily sharing a complimentary copy of our primer on some of the work we did recently. So this is really about the sustainability software landscape. So how technology is driving that sustainability momentum. So if you look at the link that's in the comments window, you'll be able to sign up and get a complimentary copy of this. And our teams are happy to address any questions. So we hope you find this useful. And soon we'll pop in the chat again, the link to Climate GPT. So you can go there, check it out. I think they're doing some interesting work around that. So, the last 45 minutes have flown past. I want to be mindful of the time that we have Babish and Rita. We could go on for hours, but I don't know if everybody will still be awake. So let's maybe try and think about, the future. So we reflected on COP, we reflected on the market this year. We spoke about Gen AI and tech and data. Let's talk, about 2024 and where do you think we are in terms of our sustainability journeys as businesses, but also as society. So what I'm going to do is put on my talk show hat, host hat and ask you one thing that gives you hope for sustainability in 2024, and one thing that gives you despair. So I don't know. I didn't want to put you on the spot, but I will. So Babish, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think this COP will give me continuous hope for the next year to come about consensus and coalitions. So there's capital, there's brain power, and people with ambition, drive, and intentions. I heard somebody say, "We're done now here. Let's put the blinders on and go." And I think that's the spirit. And I think with the same goal in mind, that is the perfect hope for next year. And then a lot will be achieved. I trust that. The spare is the elections and the extreme right movements. But again, let me close off positively. I think if the consensus on climate is so enormous as we have seen now with all the countries, it does not matter. There is simply no space left for climate deniers. So whatever the outcome of elections will be, this hope will thrive.
Yep. No, I think the election point is really interesting. I read something somewhere which blew my mind. I knew there were a lot of big elections that are happening. Obviously, the US, the UK, the India, to name a few. But
Yeah.
apparently, there are 30 plus elections next year. So that'll be interesting to watch out. And there are apparently more than 3.5 billion people that are going to be voting in one
Yeah,
single
half
year,
of the
which is
population.
Yep, exactly. So closer to four. So
Yeah,
it's an incredible moment in time, just given where we are as a society and the social contract that we share. So I think some of that is really going to dictate how we move forward. Rita, what about you?
Well,
What gives
I'm
you hope? What gives you despair?
just because we talked about the election thing, I'm going to actually do two. I would say on the first one, what you prompted me thinking about is I'm optimistic because young people are very engaged, be it in elections or in climate justice or in human rights activities or economic development activities. There's just a whole movement, and be it in the private sector, right? I think a lot of businesses are doing a lot of initiatives to engage young people and make sure that they feel that they're in a place that's doing something good. So young people give me a lot of optimism. I think the other thing that gives me optimism, and it's really building off of Babish's point on partnership, is the number of players and the different types of players that are now in the room. I think back to just New York City during UNGA week, which was also Climate Week, but you really couldn't tell the difference between those events because of the intersectionality of these issues. So that gives me a lot of optimism. I think the only thing that like really does keep me awake at night these days is the geopolitical challenges. There's just so much suffering and intractable issues that looking for solutions seems very difficult. But if climate can be an example, right, of parties coming together that have completely disparate objectives and are coming together and caring for the planet, maybe we can do the same for people, in those same negotiations that are necessary. So I think that's where I'm at.
Those are really interesting points. And I if I try and summarize the discussion we've had today, I think first, I think it's fair to say that all of us are more optimistic versus being pessimistic about where things are, which is a great thing to have. Yes, the year's been tough. I think from an economy and a geopolitical perspective, things will get worse before they become better. But I'm glad that we are more optimistic, and we see this moving forward in a meaningful way. I think the second thing which came through in the discussion today was this focus on simplicity, reducing waste. How do we do more with less, or what's existing, and make sure we utilize that to its maximum potential versus creating new stuff, technologies, approaches. I think there's a lot more we can do with what exists. I really like Babish's point on the fact that this is not optional anymore. So this is sustainability is not a choice. I think it's really an imperative and existential thing that we really need to get behind. And in some ways, maybe the last decade or 2011 to 20 was about arguing about the problem, whether there's a problem or not. But now this decade is really about the decade of action, and the time will run out if you don't do something quickly. And Rita, to you, I really loved your points around how do we keep this in perspective, right? Given the journey we've been on, and it's not something that we're doing right now, but the journey we started many, many years ago, and making sure we can balance it, keep it more holistic, look at including different groups, and not just make it about one specific narrow topic. So I think we have addressed a lot of the questions. I'm going to take a quick scan and make sure that there's no specific question that's pending. If you were not able to ask a question today for some reason, and if you have something, please feel free to use this video and add a question here. And if you can't do that, just reach out to us. We'll be more than happy to respond. But Babish and Rita, I really wanted to thank you for your time. Thanks for taking the time out. I know December's busy as we run up to the holidays. So thanks a lot for taking the time out today. I learned a lot. I'm sure the audience did as well. And I can't wait for the next one.
Thank you very much, and happy holidays, everybody.
Thank you so much. This was a great
Thank you.
conversation.
Thank you, everyone.
See you soon. Bye-bye.